Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that egregious film known as Game of Death. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and unfortunately I couldn't record all of this particular episode on my own. There will be impersonators throughout of my voice.
It'll be a bit subtle, but you may be able to spot the impersonators' voices.
Hello, I'm Bryan, and for this entire episode, I'm actually being dubbed over by a different actor, so you won't be able to tell the difference, though, obviously.
I mean, whoever's doing the dubbing, amazing job.
Great job.
Sounds really similar, yeah. But welcome everybody, yes, to our latest episode, the first episode of 2025. So happy New Year out there to all of you. Hopefully things are just going smoothly already.
Hopefully the world's still alive for us to put
still
this out.
Spinning and all that. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, so we've reached, this midpoint of our Criterion season, Bryan. And we're doing the E for egregious pick. And this was a difficult one to kind of wrangle choices for. Because, obviously Criterion, mark of quality. And we really emphasize on stuff that's related to spine numbers. And when you have those parameters with Criterion, it's hard to find a bad one to devote a lot of time to.
Yeah, I feel like, they have weird choices every now and then where they will put out a movie that, I think we've mentioned, Triangle of Sadness a few times. We're not big fans of that movie. That's kind of a weird one, but, stuff like that. Or, yeah, just weird choices that they have where I feel like they often will put out movies that are very important and are very, are thought of as, classic films, but are not very good. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. I don't know if you would have any, but I just think that it happens every once in a while with some Criterion releases,
Yeah, I think what mostly happens, and it's the case with the movie that we're talking about today, more likely ones that at least have the spine number, because keep in mind, for our season, we weren't including anything that was just streamed on the Criterion Collection streaming service, because they technically had recently that Razzies winners little collection, which was a very fun collection of terrible movies that we could have technically culled from. But in most cases, in terms of stuff with the spine number, it would tend to be movies that are usually a part of a box set. That's where you'll find usually ones that are kind of bad. For example, a movie we talked about before, in passing, All Out Monsters Attack, the Godzilla film, would technically kind of count that way. Or also with the Koyaanisqatsi trilogy. Not so much I love Koyaanisqatsi. I think Padakotsky, I believe that's what the second one is. Those are both pretty good. But that third one, Nakatsi, is one of the worst things I've ever seen. Truly, just a fucking waste of time. Raves Thomas of Cinema to the Letter. It's just so dull. I think that's the thing, is when you want to be a bit more comprehensive with those Criterion sets, that includes some movies that are usually kind of bad. Even one that I wouldn't even describe as completely awful, but just one of the dullest movies I've ever sat through that does have a Criterion spine is Jonathan Demme's A Master Builder.
I've never seen that one.
Truly one of the most boring movies that I've ever watched. Just it's just Wallace Shawn in a bed for a lot of it. Just constantly my whole life, it's been leading up to this point. And a couple people come in and they're just oh my god, you're dying, Wallace Shawn. Yep, I'm dying. That's me. Wallace Shawn. You could tell from this great impression I'm doing. But yeah, so stuff like that where it feels almost like a weird favor or obligation kind of thing for as that's usually where you get some of like the lesser movies sneaking on to like the Criterion physical releases.
Yeah, I feel like it can also be with like certain directors that Criterion like loves. Like, just so many Godard movies on there, and like there are some pretty bad Godard movies that are included in the Criterion collection, but because Godard is like, you know, such an important filmmaker, they include them, which is nice, but you know, they're not always great movies.
No, for sure. But yeah, we should probably get into the movie we're designated to talk about today. Because I think before we even get to the trailer, I think we can both mutually agree on this, Brian. We've done, like, this is our 8th season now, so we've covered 8 different egregious movies for each season. And I think it's safe to say that the one we're covering today is the worst movie we have covered. Right?
Well, I mean, we did talk about Wish Upon, which is a very fun movie. It's a very fun, bad movie.
Right.
But it's still a very bad movie.
The difference between like this and a Wish Upon is like Wish Upon is, like you mentioned, kind of fun, versus this movie, as we'll talk about, is interchangeably boring and just flat out disrespectful on so many fucking levels. Yeah. So let's just jump into it. We're going to be talking about Game of Death.
Superstar, Superman, the one, the only, the immortal, Bruce Lee. In the super screen excitement of them all, Game of Death. Never such action, never such incredible feats. 4 years in the making. Lee's last is his best. See him conquer 7'4" colossus Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. From the same talented trio that gave you Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Return of the Dragon, and Enter the Dragon, star Bruce Lee. A giant in his time, a legend in his death. He lives again. Bruce Lee, Game of Death.
So, Game of Death came out on March 23rd, 1978 in Hong Kong, and June 9th, 1979 eventually in the U.S. From directors, we should know technically there are 2 credited directors here. There's Robert Klaus, and the other one is Bruce Lee, who we should probably get into the Bruce Lee of it all right off the bat. So this is technically the 5th Bruce Lee movie, and if you're somehow unaware, basically Bruce Lee was this Hong Kong martial artist who became very famous, particularly with like some of his later films, because he had worked in the industry to some degree, and he'd worked in film to some degree for like most of his life. There's footage of him as like a child actor in like Hong Kong TV shows and stuff like that. But he did come over to the States at a certain point because he was born in San Francisco, but spent a lot of his life in Hong Kong. Then came back to San Francisco and eventually got into the Hollywood film industry, with probably most notably in like the 60s era was like the Green Hornet TV show where he played Kato. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of where people started to like have some kind of interest in him, especially doing martial arts stuff. But he went back to Hong Kong and made a few movies, specifically The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, The Way of the Dragon, and was making Game of Death in like late 1972, in like September and October. He was doing this after he had started directing with Way of the Dragon, and he was going to direct Game of Death as this like big sort of passion project production that was going to really explore like his concepts of like what martial arts was and all this other stuff. And he left after about that month of production to make Enter the Dragon, which was a big Hollywood co-production with Golden Harvest, which is of course the big sort of Hong Kong studio that Lee had been working with for these earlier movies. And it was like a big first like American co-production for like a big martial arts movie, and became very famous, though tragically Lee died about 3 weeks prior to that movie coming out, which is so fascinating, especially with like, for context, I was only culturally aware of Bruce Lee for a while. I didn't see any of his movies until like the last few years or so, but it's so strange when you find out that like Enter the Dragon, which was so massively successful and spawned so many like attempts to like rip off that kind of like, you know, Bruce Lee energy. There's a whole genre of movies called Bruceploitation, in which people under stage names like Bruce Lay and Bruce Lie, like L-E and L-I, would like make movies where they were basically doing Bruce Lee shtick. Like all of that happens after he dies at like age 32, very tragically, from a cerebral edema, which is basically like an overabundance of fluid in like the brain, evidently. So that just caused basically like a sort of like coma to set in, and then he died tragically. So Enter the Dragon becomes a massive success shortly after he dies. And then, you know, all these Bruceploitation movies come out, and this Game of Death footage is left just like sitting there. A solid like 120 minutes of footage that he shot, though a lot of that is also like outtakes and stuff from like basically what was supposed to be the climax of the movie. And this footage was sitting there, and then eventually in 1978, Golden Harvest was like, you know what, let's actually get that footage and assemble a movie around it vaguely. And that they did. But before we get into Game of Death itself, Bryan, you also really weren't that aware of Bruce Lee, even like in the lead to this episode. So you watched a couple of his movies in prep, right?
I did, yeah. I mean, I think my knowledge of Bruce Lee mainly comes from like cultural osmosis and like, you know, he's one of those figures that I feel like has been like his image, his likeness has been used in like parodies and just kind of like, you know, cartoons and shows and stuff like that, where it's like he is like very iconic, but I didn't really know a lot about him. Most of my kind of, weirdly enough, my cultural reference for him would have been Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a very weird scene, I think. However, yeah, I watched a couple of his movies, Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon, one of which I may be talking about a little bit later. But one, I think what you said, like just that he only made 5 movies, which is very, it's not what I thought of, I think, for a long time. I always thought that he had kind of either a longer career, and of course I'd forgotten that he did like, you know, the Green Hornet TV show and stuff like that, but a very limited filmography. And yet while watching these couple of movies, I realized how many of like just shots or clips I had seen on like the internet and or just referenced in other movies as well, which do them. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about Tarantino, I think, in a little bit, but it's very interesting just seeing what he does. It's kind of his physicality, the martial arts, all of that stuff, and how you kind of have this like instantly like, oh yeah, you understand why this guy became such an icon, such a celebrity internationally. And it is also, I think, very upsetting learning about his death during this movie, of course, because of, as well, his son Brandon Lee, of course, who tragically died during The Crow. I think just like watching these movies, I was really impressed by like him and like how iconic he is instantly, and just the way he moves, the way he carries himself, just his mannerisms and stuff like that, which, you know, is a problem when it comes to our main film. But yeah, I've only seen I guess 3 of those now. I really do want to see the other ones because I'm fascinated by just these movies in general, because they feel very indebted to like other American genre movies, you know, like Way of the Dragon feels very much like a Western, and Enter the Dragon feels like a Bond movie. And I really like that style, you know, like Enter the Dragon and Game of Death both have this kind of like Bond intro sequence, title sequence, which I think is really cool. And I like that kind of like style, that kind of like goofy, but kind of like, you know, we're dealing with like crime and you know, gangsters and stuff like that. I like this kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, for me, prior to seeing any of his movies, I think the only thing I'd really seen him in was Speaking to the Green Hornet. There's an episode of the 60s Batman TV show, which my dad loved, so I definitely like watched as much of that on TV Land as he would force down my throat. But I still enjoy that show a lot, and particularly there's an episode where he crosses over with the Green Hornet called A Piece of the Action, where it is like Bruce Lee is a part of that as Kato and everything like that. And even from there, or any of like the cultural osmosis stuff, I agree. I think particularly being like, you know, a younger millennial, I watched so much shit that was made by Gen Xers who fucking love Bruce Lee
Right.
and put Bruce Lee up as sort of like an icon. And I think that's why for a while I was kind of hesitant, because Bruce Lee was kind of put on the same pedestal as like a poster of Scarface, you know, where it's just like the worst people kind of liked it. And I'm like, I don't know if that interests me as much. But I think with like watching those Bruce Lee movies, it's fascinating. I agree with you that he's like so instantly iconic, but also he feels like just, you can see so much of culture for like the 50 years after his death and how much it has been influenced by him with like, you know, just the way that when he's fighting, he makes like those specific noises. Like how many fucking like movies, TV shows, cartoons, anything like that have, whenever a person does like sort of kung fu, quote unquote, they make noises like that. That's all Bruce Lee shit. That's all like instantly like his shit. And there's obviously like certain bits of iconography, and even like as a video game fan, I think you can also agree that like watching, particularly I would say like Enter the Dragon, like so much of video game like stuff comes from these Bruce Lee movies. Particularly like even The Big Boss, his first movie, is often credited with creating the concept of a final boss. Because like that's how, spoilers, that movie ends, where they keep building up like, oh, the big boss, you gotta get to the big boss, and then he does and has like a big final fight scene.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few sort of video game touch points I thought of that I can get into as we get into the movie. But I think like the most obvious one I thought of was like Street Fighter, you know, because these movies often have like these really wide shots of the action, and you have that kind of like classic like there's a few shots in Enter the Dragon and Way of the Dragon that just straight up look like a stage from like Street Fighter or something, because it has that sort of you know, the two shot. And it also just is fascinating because of like obviously his moves, right? Like the sort of actual martial arts moves he does, you see a lot in like Street Fighter. Like there's one in Game of Death that is like just straight up a Chun-Li like move from Street Fighter. And I just think about this the way that I grew up, and like I'm sure a lot of people grew up, like when you sort of like fake fight with like your friends, you also make those like quote unquote kung fu like noises. But I didn't even like I wouldn't have known that came from Bruce Lee, and so it's just so ingrained into like our culture that like without even thinking about it, like you know these things, and it's like it's really fascinating. And I think, you know, especially watching like those movies, you get a really interesting sense of how impressive I think like all of like his moves are, and the movies really love like show like, because of the sort of wide shots that they do, like they love just showing you him doing stuff, which is incredibly iconic just in itself, I think, you know.
Well, and I also like that with Bruce Lee movies, there tends to be kind of this interesting kind of like interracial casting, where obviously like the movies that were made in Hong Kong, particularly like Big Boss, is very like, you know, specifically like Hong Kong actors. But as he got more clout to be able to make more of these movies, he liked having sort of diverse casts and having them play like sort of notable characters when they come in. Like obviously in this movie there's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or even in The Way of the Dragon there's like Chuck Norris. Where it's just like, oh, we gotta have like this dude come out and you don't know a lot about him except he is a badass who can fight against Bruce Lee, and he has some distinctive thing. For like, you know, Kareem, it's that he's 7'2", and for like Chuck Norris, it's that he's the hairiest man who could possibly come out shirtless and fight Bruce Lee. And I like the fact that he always has like these distinctive villains to even fight against. Even in like Enter the Dragon, one of the main sort of other people that pops in, like fucking John Saxon popping in. I think it's like a great example of that, where just like a distinctive kind of character actor type who comes in and feels like he's like on Bruce's level the whole time and stuff like that. I think he does such a great job of realizing like, I can be this badass, but like I have to go up against people who seem kind of like intimidating and interesting for me to like fight against. Like the opponent is like, that's what makes the fight. And that's something that like with his style of martial arts, which I believe was known as Gung Fu, G-U-N-G. Apologies if I mess anything up. I crammed like some documentaries in prep for this episode as well, so apologies if I miss any details. But with that style and like the way that he at least started, you know, like in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, they established this whole thing of like he would have like private lessons for people and stuff. He was very open about like, I want to teach like anybody who seems like they have an interest in, you know, martial arts, this sort of thing. I don't want to like covet this necessarily. And he was also very adamant about like, at the time, more people were familiar with like jujitsu kind of style, which is like from once again more of what I understand. In case you haven't seen me in real life, I am not the most agile person. I also don't watch a lot of like martial arts competitions, but there tended to be much more of like a sort of you would like kick or punch, do a certain move, and then you would get points off of it, like a big tournament kind of thing. Versus like with the gung fu style, Bruce Lee was much more about you have to be like water. That was like his big catchphrase. It was like you have to be like water. You have to move quickly. Like if you pour water into a cup, the cup becomes the water, that kind of thing, where it's like you have to be fluid and you can't just be rigid with like whatever moves there are. And I think that really comes across even in A Game of Death, the footage we see of Bruce Lee. There's a lot of that kind of like flexibility. And also what I love, a big thing that is like so prominent about Bruce Lee is like his fighting style and whatnot is he doesn't over convolute his fighting techniques. It's not like an elaborate series of moves to hit like one guy. It's like one or two moves and that guy's fucking down. Like I love that in The Big Boss. There's like a whole scene where a bunch of guys like this, the biggest fucking fault anybody does in a Bruce Lee movie. It's kind of like in a horror movie going into a haunted house. It's like, don't go up against Bruce Lee. Like, don't do that. Like if I was in a Bruce Lee movie, I would simply not be on his bad side, because that dude only needs to like punch you in the face and then like on the gut and you're like dead. It's over. His, to quote Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, "My hands are registered lethal weapons." Like, you don't fuck with that guy, because that guy will just take you out like you're nothing. He will fold you like laundry.
I mean, I think that's what I like about a lot of the action in the good Bruce Lee movies I've seen, where it's like it's just very quick. There isn't this kind of unnecessary, like, almost like padding onto an action scene. Like, you know, an action scene can be, we can have these kind of elaborate sequences like in this movie when we have like the big finale, but there's also just plenty of times where he just like kicks someone in the face and then that's it, and they get knocked out, and it's like that's it. But because of his physicality, because of like just the way he moves, it's incredibly satisfying, and it is incredibly impactful. And I also just kind of think of like in terms of the whole like the villains and the who he's fighting kind of matter. I think that also does tie into a lot, like video games, for instance, because a lot of the time early on he's just fighting like random goons, you know, and you sort of have to like build up to. I haven't seen The Big Boss, but like you have to build up to the final boss or the final kind of like. Game of Death has like a boss rush basically, where he has to fight like like 3 or 4 like bosses basically, like mini bosses, which yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think just the physicality just goes like such a long way in these movies, and especially in something like Game of Death, where like you can really tell when it's not Bruce Lee in this movie. Like it's incredibly obvious, which I think is more like that more kind of proves what we're saying of like how iconic he is, just his physicality, where just even if you can't see his face necessarily, even if he's kind of like if they're trying to hide him because it's a double, like you can just tell it's not him, and when it is him, you can just tell because of that physicality and the way he moves and stuff.
No, yeah, that physicality is really, really important, honestly, with like so much of Lee's work, where like you just see even that when he's not fighting, his stances, like when he's just even standing around or whatever, he's got just like this immediate presence when he just comes in. Like, I don't even know if you're a martial artist, but it's just like you're a really fascinating person. And it is interesting with, like you mentioned, the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood thing. I give a lot of credit to that actor. Upon now seeing all the Bruce Lee movies, the actor who plays Bruce Lee in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think gets so many of the mannerisms dead accurate. And even like the voice, I will say, like if you watch any interviews where Bruce Lee is like predominantly speaking English, he has that specific pronunciation that like the actor does in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's like so aptly accurate. Then he takes off his sunglasses and immediately he looks less like Bruce Lee, which kind of is fitting for as we're talking about Game of Death, where a lot of the coverage is like, oh, let's have somebody wear sunglasses or be in shadow and bullshit like that. And it's like, oh, totally the same, completely. But yeah, I think that's the thing is he has like that personality, but also that simplicity with that. Not even just like the fighting techniques, but even just like the plots of his better movies aren't over convoluted at all. Like Enter the Dragon's literally just like you go to this island where there's like a big fighting competition, Everybody fights each other. Or with the big boss, it's like, oh, he's going back to like his sort of hometown, and they all work for this one dock worker guy who ends up screwing them over. So Bruce Lee gets his vengeance. It's a very pro-union movie, The Big Boss, in an interesting way. But yeah, and even like Way of the Dragon, very simple words. Like he's going over to his master's daughter's business in or cousin or whatever, like whatever, some familiar connection, going over to Italy, of course, where you think a Bruce Lee movie would take place in Italy. Help her out with like the business that's going on, and then gangsters come in and try and fuck shit up, and he fucks them up in return. Like fairly simple plots that allow for like the big action set pieces to go off, and also for Bruce Lee to just like be incredibly charming at the same time. And even with Game of Death, I should point this out that like there's a lot of interesting sort of background in terms of what Lee originally intended. Which, shout out, there's a documentary that I watched called Bruce Lee: A Warrior's Journey, which details a lot of the stuff and also includes way more of the Game of Death footage. Like pretty much all the sequences are assembled in a way that doesn't have to include the bullshit plot of Game of Death, which we'll get to. Don't worry, everybody, we'll get to it. I know you're all ecstatic to hear us talk about all the other bullshit in Game of Death. But
it's an important plot.
That's true, very important. But basically the plot of that was originally going to be that he would play like a retired champion martial artist who was battling his way up a 5-story pagoda to get a treasure for like this person that he knew. So that's even more video gamey. Even also, of course, we're calling stuff like later on, like The Raid and shit like that. We're just like up one giant tower, and there's like 5 levels, 5 bosses. We only see 3 of the bosses because it's Dan, Santo, who would be the 3rd level in his original version. Jihan Hya, who was the 4th level, and then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the 5th level, the final boss. And it would have mainly been basically like that whole like martial arts philosophy thing where Lee for each individual boss would kind of find like a weakness and kind of like take advantage of that in a way that kind of spoke to his martial arts training, where it's like it's all about like understanding your fighter, your opponent, knowing their strengths and their weaknesses, and accurately fighting against them and like adapting to the situation. And this also would have involved a couple other characters who one of which does show up in the footage, James Tian, who would have been kind of like one of his accomplices, along with Qian Yuan, who, that guy's fascinating. I found out that Qian Yuan, who's another martial artist, died in 1977 of cerebral edema at 32 as well. Oh. Like the exact same way. Really weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating. But they basically would have been his accomplices, and Tian would have been kind of like the uneasy ally. This is in some of the footage that was shot, where he'll be like, there's a bit in the extended footage where he's just like, oh yeah, why don't you go face off against that guy? Don't worry, you'll be great. And that guy gets his ass kicked. So it's like, oh, he's kind of like not quite on the up and up. So even that movie that never got finished still has some of like the things that we're talking about that have still been influential to some degree. A big part of that also is like the weird factor that like when Bruce Lee died, obviously this footage kind of sat on the shelf for a while, but the promotional images were put out of like, oh, this is some of the evidence of like what Bruce Lee had shot, including like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar being so big, and also the jumpsuit, which we should mention. Like the yellow with black striped suit has become such an incredibly iconic look for not just, the Kill Bill thing, obviously. That was the big influence for like the Kill Bill Volume 1 jumper that Uma Thurman wears. Even like when this tragedy happened and those production stills were put out, a lot of people doing these Bruceploitation movies I was referring to would like just put people in the suit and literally claim the untold story that Bruce Lee never got to finish finally on the screen, because like no one could prove that they didn't have that footage. So they just fucking did that. There's like I believe it's called Playing the Game of Death is one of those movies, which I found out through. There's a great documentary called Enter the Clones of Bruce Lee, all about all these different like weird fucking movies. There's one where apparently like a lot of them center around Bruce Lee having died, and they're like prequels about like his origins or like what would follow. A lot of the kind of like conspiracy, like how did he die? Was it mafiosos? Shit like that kind of swirled around. There's one that's like he dies and goes to heaven, and then he faces off against multiple different like fictional characters like Dracula and fucking...
Wait, that sounds good. That sounds great.
I kind of want to
talk
watch
about that.
Right? Criterion put that one out. Where yeah, it would like Dracula and like mummies, but also like Al Capone, I think, just like a bunch of weird fucking people Bruce Lee has to like fight against. Crazy.
Fucking Harry Truman, I don't know, like just to give random historical figures.
The 1996 Chicago Bulls, just a bunch of different characters he has to face off against. But yeah, so that suit even became iconic before any of this footage came out. And admittingly, like, it's an amazing fucking suit. I get why. Like, it just, like, instantly, just, like, that is the ultimate image of, like, a badass motherfucker who I don't want to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, the yellow, it's such an iconic jumpsuit that, like, it's the jumpsuit and also the like, yellow Adidas he's wearing, which are fucking, they look so cool.
Yes.
And it is so iconic that, like, before we were doing this, I looked up, like, oh yeah, right, that's, he wears, like, the yellow jumpsuit that inspired the bride. Like, I Googled, like, where that came from, and it was from Game of Death. But I got confused because of, like, what we were talking about with its kind of, like, weird production and how he died during production and stuff like that, that it's, like, it's very weird that, like, the look that a lot of people associate with him comes from this movie that kind of doesn't star him in a lot of places. It's very weird, and yet, like, when that action sequence happens and he's wearing the yellow jumpsuit, it's really incredible. I can't really, like, deny it. And I will also say, like, his original premise for this movie being that sort of, like, the raid style, like, going up the tower, like, sounds great. Like, sounds really fucking cool. And it's kind of what I like about, like, the other Bruce Lee movies I watched, because, you know, it's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like, he's using just, like, basic tropes and conventions from genres and a very basic story to just get to a lot of the action and create, like, obviously create action, but create a lot of comedy and stuff like that. And I don't know, that is such a great premise for a movie. I would have loved if this movie was that instead, because, you know, again, we'll get to the very important and very, very complex plot of this movie, but like, it just sounds way, way, way more interesting. Yeah, and I mean, like, again, just thinking about the kind of video game connection, like, speaking of kind of that, like, going up the 5 levels, it reminds me a lot of, like, this game that came out a couple years ago called Sifu, Sifu, is this kind of beat 'em up game, like, third-person beat 'em up game that has, like, really kind of complex, like, martial arts combat. You can use, like, weapons and stuff, but it feels like that, where you're just going through these, like, levels, and you have a boss at the end, and the game is kind of built upon, like, replaying a lot of it. So you replay the levels and kind of try to, like, perfect it, right? And kind of get through, kind of like a Bruce Lee movie. Like, he doesn't always get through unscathed, but, like, you try to have that sort of, like, perfect sort of martial arts, like, run.
Which kind of mirrors also with, like, Game of Death. If you see, like, I know, because, like, some documentary recently, there was, like, a 5-hour-long documentary that had, like, the full 2 hours of, like, all the outtakes and shit that Bruce Lee shot, basically, like, put together. I saw this one montage of, like, him doing the nunchucks bit in the Game of Death footage. He does, like, 70 fucking takes of, like, just individual shots of that. He's just, like, that much of a perfectionist, where he's just like, I gotta fucking get this so right. And you don't notice any fucking, like, just minuscule, like, timing things, really. Then, like, I don't know, I probably would have called cut after maybe 10 takes, Bruce, but it's like, nope, gotta get very accurate. And I think that's what even is the big difference with, like, if you watch all the other movies, because, like, he only directs fully Way of the Dragon. And I think you can even see that with, like, between that and Enter the Dragon, which was directed by Robert Close as well, who shot all the new Game of Death footage. The difference between the two, I think you can tell that, like, particularly with Way of the Dragon, there's a lot more of that kind of precision and really highlighting the different fight sequences, as opposed to, like, in Enter the Dragon, I think there's definitely, like, oh, let's just let Bruce do what he does, but there's not as much, like, configuration of, like, the best exact shot for any individual, like, fight move, as much as there is in Way of the Dragon.
Yeah, I mean, like, Enter the Dragon definitely feels more like, I mean, I used the Bond comparison earlier, but it feels like a Bond movie. Klaus, like, shoots it like a Bond movie. It looks like one of the, like, of the kind of. I think that would have been before the Roger Moore era, but it reminds me of a lot of the Roger Moore.
It would have been
Bond
like
movies.
right around the start, because I believe Live and Let Die is also 73, so he's mostly
Oh,
going
okay.
off like the Connery and On Her Majesty's Secret Service kind of era of those movies, which sometimes like works a lot for that movie. I think particularly like
Oh, yeah.
the Hall of Mirrors sequence that's like so iconic feels like straight out of like weirdly like a later Bond movie, because a couple
yeah.
it's the Man with the Golden Gun has another like kind of weird fun house
That's what I
House
thought
of
of.
Mirrors kind of bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that shot of like him walking through that, like that shot of just him walking, and you get like 6 Bruces in the mirror. Like, I've seen that shot like many times, and I don't even know where I've seen it, but it is just one of those like iconic shots of Bruce Lee. Like, I think there's a lot of like pictures of him that go around, but a lot of it is like this footage, like the yellow jumpsuit, like the mirror scene. There's one like shot in Way of Death that is just this like dolly like pan, and it's not even doing that much, but I've seen it. Like I as I was watching Way of the Dragon, I was like, oh, I've seen this somewhere, and it is just kind of the way that like he has become so ingrained into like our cultural idea of like kung fu and of martial arts movies. You could argue, and this is a separate conversation, but like you could argue that like he's done so to the point where like you said, with all the kind of like Bruce exploitation movies, like that's gotten kind of diluted, where like most people just don't know that Bruce Lee is that. But I think like people still know obviously Bruce Lee, and like clearly like someone like Tarantino, who I also think like Mike Moe is the actor in that in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He's very good in that movie, and I think he is like the best part of that scene, because I think that scene, although I get a lot of like Tarantino's reverence for Bruce Lee, the writing in that scene makes him out to seem more like a caricature than it is respectful. I think all the ways that he's become just like so baked into what we think of when we think of like a martial arts movie and a martial arts like master, I guess. It's I don't know, it's really fascinating.
I will say the one thing with the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood thing, I will concede, because like before I had watched any of like the interviews and stuff, I was kind of like, wow, they make Bruce Lee out to be kind of an asshole. I wouldn't say Bruce Lee was an asshole by an extent, but there is a lot of footage of him being kind of like a hothead to some degree. Not necessarily like the Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali kind of like comments that he's making. There's been a bit of like back and forth about like, did he actually say anything like that, or was he like more respectful? That's part of like kind of the legend of Bruce Lee. It's weird where like Bruce Lee also kind of fits into a category of like almost mythological pop culture figure as well,
Yeah.
where like there's a lot of like, oh, Bruce Lee, like the lethal weapons of his hands, he could like fight you like this, whatever. That weirdly kind of morphed. I remember when I was a kid, there was like the Chuck Norris jokes, which ties in given like Way of the Dragon, where it's just like, oh yeah, Chuck Norris has like a fist underneath his beard or whatever bullshit. And honestly, especially after watching stuff like Way of the Dragon, it's like, why did Chuck Norris ever have that reputation compared to
Right.
like a Bruce Lee? Honestly, just like the Bruce Lee thing should have lived on, as opposed to like Walker Texas Ranger over here. Not nearly as badass.
I mean, it's really interesting, yeah, because like Chuck Norris is another figure like this, yeah, where like when I was growing up as a kid, he was thought of as like, oh, he's a badass, he's so tough, whatever. And then I watched Way of the Dragon, and I think it was my first time seeing Chuck Norris like not the look you associate with him, with like the beard and he's a bit older and stuff like that. And all I could think of was like, oh, this is Chuck Norris, like he's just a fucking hairy ass guy. Like, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to kind of actually watch, a movie with these people who, yes, have become like so mythologized. I don't know. It's still the only Chuck Norris movie I've seen, and I don't know if I will dive into anymore. But
Excuse me, I know you've seen Expendables 2, sir.
Oh, yeah,
How
I've seen
dare you?
Expendables 2. Yeah.
Where they literally make Chuck Norris jokes because that's funny. Because that's what you want to see, is a bunch of those guys doing the fucking meme jokes you do. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what you want to fucking see. Yeah. Personally, I prefer my Chuck Norris in the form of the Walker Texas Ranger lever from Late Night with Conan O'Brien. I don't know if you know what this is at all.
I feel like I've heard of this, but go on.
There would be a recurring, because Conan was like part of NBC when they got bought by Universal. He was like, now I can do this thing where I have a lever at any time. I can just pull this lever and they'll show a clip of Walker, Texas Ranger. It was one of the best bits that show ever did. And it was so funny, especially there would be points, especially during the writer's strike that happened in like 2007, when like Conan couldn't do anything. He was like, what do I do now? Should I pull the lever? And the audience was like, do it. I don't know. Should I do it? All right, let me pull it. And particularly, there's one great bit. I think I saw this live, and it's one of the funniest fucking things I've ever seen. He pulls the lever, and a clip shows up. It's like a kid on top of like a bookshelf. And he's like a really big bookshelf. And there's a guy down there just like, come on down, jump down, don't worry, I'll catch you. And then slow motion as the kid like jumps and falls, and that guy, you see him like have his arms outstretched, but then he just moves out of the way, and that kid hits the ground, and then they cut back to Conan, and he's like walking around his desk in like a panic, like, oh my god, that kid hit the ground! I can't believe it!
God, Conan is so fucking funny, man.
Look, hey, when this episode's coming out, we're only about 2 months away from his Oscars.
Oh, what a great choice.
Can't
so
wait.
excited.
Can't wait for that. Yeah, speaking of excited, Bryan, should we finally talk about Game of Death? Because we've been really, it's been the elephant in the room this whole time, the actual subject of our episode. But yeah, so, the actual movie Game of Death that came out in theaters didn't end up resembling a lot of Bruce Lee's original plans, because obviously he had passed away. So they ended up assembling roughly this movie that follows Bruce Lee's character, who is named Billy Lowe. He is a martial arts movie star guy who's in the middle of shooting some movies when he runs afoul of like these like gangsters who have like weird protection money on him. This is where the movie makes like one of its very first crucial mistakes of like, the plot for this movie isn't like complicated as much as convoluted, where I'm like, why? How? Like, what do they have on him? Like, why are they intimidating him? What's the connection? I don't fucking get it. Especially when the scene where a lot of this is exposited has some of the most distracting attempts to like work around Bruce Lee. Because in the movie, when it's not either the footage from Game of Death he originally shot that mostly pops up at the end of the movie, or archival footage from the previous movies. Like, literally, the opening of this movie is the Chuck Norris finale bit from Way of Death. Just plastered in as like, oh, this is the movie that Billy Lowe's making. When they don't have that footage, there are a couple different doubles that sit in for Bruce Lee. There's Kim Tae-young, Yuen Bao, and Albert Sham are like the main ones that pop up. And they really do a very inconsistent job of like even trying to do any kind of disguising, where there's like a lot of shots of him like in profile or from behind or even straight on but at a distance or in shadow. But then in this particular scene where he comes, I believe Gig Young is in his trailer playing Jim Marshall. He is there in his trailer, and we have reverse shots of like the Billy Lowe character, and the first one is like him with the towel draped over his neck, which is established as he's going into the trailer, but then they have like a head-on shot, and it's like some fucking Adult Swim animation bullshit, where they have like the towel draped over footage of Bruce Lee mouthing words, but he's saying like, what are you doing in my trailer, with the poorly dubbed voice. There's that, and then the infamous one, where he's sitting in front of like his makeup chair, and he's got like the big mirror, and they literally just have a cardboard cutout of Bruce Lee's face plastered over one of the doubles, as, you know, Gig Young is saying like, hey man, you gotta, you know, pay us some of this protection money or else we're gonna kill you.
It's a real jump scare.
Yeah, it is a jump scare. It's a nightmare, honestly.
Yeah.
This is the first time I ever watched this movie, and when that happened, I was really in a place, because like, I knew this one had a bad reputation, but I was like, could there be some kind of charm in seeing them try to like assemble this movie? And then that stuff happens, I'm like, no, this isn't charming at all. This is like ghoulish shit.
Yeah. The effect looks like the sort of like lo-fi like effect that you would see in like a David Lynch, like, you know, like Twin Peaks: The Return or something. Like, it just
Right.
it really looks like that kind of thing, but they're trying to pretend like it's Bruce Lee. And the problem with it, right, is that this is what the movie starts with. Like, this is where like this is what you're leading with. And there's just like many shots in this early sequence where they're not even like that far away. Like it's just a shot of Bruce Lee, and you can just tell that it's straight up not him. Like it just looks like a completely different guy, and it's not only just very distracting, but it's incredibly obvious. And again, it's like all the stuff we were talking about earlier of like how iconic Bruce Lee is, and how when you see him, even like the movies I've seen of his, like even if you see him from like far away, or if you see him just kind of like standing there doing nothing, like you can tell it's Bruce Lee. Like he just stands out because of like, again, just how iconic he is. And yeah, it's so jarring and so weird. And it's even weirder when you get like, I think the scene, like he walks into the trailer, you get like an insert shot of actual Bruce Lee that is clearly like from some other, like it's clearly footage that isn't of like as high quality as the other footage, so it looks really weird, so it stands out even more. And it becomes even more jarring when you see like the real Bruce Lee, because of how weird it is just seeing these very obvious doubles. It's so weird. I don't like it.
Yeah, I think particularly, like, no offense to, like, at least these guys who are doing the doubling and, you know, trying to earn some money. Like, even shout out, Kim Tai-young did do a couple of those Bruceploitation movies, particularly. The one that I know I've seen and I think is, like, amazing is No Retreat, No Surrender, which is a movie that's about, like, teenage kid who, like, his dad, like, runs, like, a dojo, and he ends up getting pushed away by gangsters, and by the way, their henchman is Jean-Claude Van Damme in his first like Brussels movie. And they're just like, oh, you gotta get out of town, so like move to a different town. And the kid is like trying to, you know, become like a better martial artist because his dad has quit the business and has become a bartender. And he ends up being trained by the ghost of Bruce Lee. And he's played by this guy who just like pops up and like trains him. By the way, this is like 89. Or 86. This is 86, so it's been over a decade since Bruce Lee died. And they're doing that shit. And they keep cutting to, like, the kid has a poster of Bruce Lee. And it's a similar thing to what you're talking about, where it's just, like, you keep cutting to, like, actual images of Bruce Lee, and you just instantly can tell, like, these two people don't look anything alike.
Even when he's wearing, like, sunglasses, even when he's in, like, shadow, you can just, like, tell it's not him. You know, maybe you can kind of, like, speak to this since you watched, like, a few of the documentaries about this, but, like, it's very weird also, because, like, one, this isn't a situation like The Crow or like Fast 7, for instance, where like the actor died during production, but the movie was mostly completed, and so like you have to do a bit of like, you know, kind of figuring out how to, you know, fill in some of the blanks. But like this is one, the plot is completely different, and we'll get to like just I think one of the other reasons the movie just doesn't work. It just doesn't feel like this was intended at all with the Bruce Lee footage. It really does feel like Frankenstein together, and with the various like qualities of the footage, it just really just feels like this cobbled together mess. Especially in these early bits where like all the stuff we're saying of like the doubles and how obvious it is, but also like yeah, just how fucking weird the plot of this movie is. Like on paper, I really like the idea of this kind of like meta commentary on like Bruce Lee that the movie's kind of trying to do, of like he's an international star and he's kind of he's acclaimed this fame, and I guess these people are trying to take it away from him, kind of, or something. But like to know that wasn't what the movie was supposed to be, right? Like the movie was just supposed to be this very simple martial arts movie where he goes up this tower. Like it just also feels weird, you know. It's a bit icky feeling, you know.
Oh, not even a bit. This movie is like we mentioned, like ghoulish, exploitative, monstrous to like certain degrees. But with like even that premise, it feels kind of like meta, but in a bankrupt. Like, what do we do? I guess Bruce Lee was, you know, famous international kung fu artist guy, so let's do that, right? Let's just kind of paste that footage into like that, because that's all we could really muster. And there's not really a lot of interesting commentary on even like that international stardom.
Oh no,
from like this Billy Lowe character at all, right? Because they play it in a way that feels like almost uncomfortable with stuff like Colin Camp, who has kind of like the weird third billing basically of this movie. She plays the love interest for Billy Lowe, who is this like she's a singer who is like his love interest, and you know is constantly there's so much footage of like either her or the gangsters like on the phone with like other people talking around this character that they don't want to show the whole time. So that's also why this movie is like so fucking boring. Like that's another sin of this movie. Like, there's so much fucking time of just like, oh, let me call on the phone. Oh, did you hear about Billy Lowe? Yes, he's over here in this place. Oh, interesting. Let's go after Billy Lowe. And it's like, get to like some fucking fighting, man. That's what we want to see.
I mean, yeah. The other thing with this movie is that like, with Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon, obviously those movies are showcasing like Bruce Lee, and how much like the plots are just there to serve Bruce Lee beating the fuck out of just like random goons. And because of course this movie doesn't have Bruce Lee, you spend a lot of time with these villains. And like, again, I love cartoonish, like over the top villains like this in like a Bond movie, in Way of the Dragon and Enter the Dragon. But like, what's the point? You know, if we have to spend so much time with these villains and we don't get a lot of these like the martial arts sequences, which is the reason we go to a Bruce Lee movie, you would think. Like, I don't understand what the point is, and how much time we spend with like these villains is like, it's a lot, and it's really boring, and it goes on for a really long time, you know. And
right, this movie's 100 minutes long, and the entire time it's like, guys, legally you could have made this 80 minutes long, and 10 minutes of that would have been the footage from Game of Death, so you only need to fill up like 70 minutes at most. But making it like this fucking long, and like doing it once again with just like so much talking, you could cut so many of those talking bits, and you would have at least like some of the other like action beats. There are action beats in this movie, and the first one with like the motorcycle guys is pretty terrible. It's like so choppily put together, and they're trying to do the Bruce Lee thing that we were talking about, like, oh, like one hit gets like all these guys down, like a bunch of guys come after him, but it's just like edited so choppily because it feels like they're kind of working around the double not quite being up to Lee's standards. But we have to introduce the jumpsuit there, right? Because we totally had to introduce it. It couldn't just be his fucking uniform or something it just wears all the time. We have to introduce that one of the motorcycle guys wears this yellow and black stripe thing, so later on he can fucking steal it from him.
I do like that. Again, also very, very video gamey, where it's like, I'm just going to wear this guy's costume. I do like the motorcycle guys, just like, they feel like they're out of a Bruce Lee movie, where it's just like, yeah, those are the goons with motorcycles who all have like these jumpsuits that are all different colored stripes. And I like it because it is just kind of like very basic, where it's like, these are the motorcycle goons.
I kind of prefer it later on when they have like the big warehouse chase.
Yeah, well, yeah.
With like them going up ramps and stuff. That's at least a bit more like, oh fuck, something's happening.
Again, it's like cool to see Colleen Camp in this movie.
Yeah.
But like, a lot of the movie focuses on like how she's dealing with like Billy Lowe's death, and like how the gangsters are trying to like still extort her, and they, you know, just all of this stuff. And it's like, this is incredibly boring and not interesting, and two, this is just not what you want to see from a Bruce Lee movie. And again, it just goes back to like, then what's the point of all this? You know, what's the point of like cobbling this thing together if it's just not going to have the main thing that you want to see until the very end, which I think we can get to, but is admittedly like really, really cool.
Right. It's very much a we need to get to the fireworks factory kind of movie, where it is so much like especially talking around it. That's the thing. Like, if they were talking about like other shit that was remotely interesting, it'd be fine. But a lot of it is just talking about Billy Lowe, and like, oh, we gotta catch Billy Lowe. I have to protect Billy Lowe. Even like the guy who runs the studio, just like, oh, we gotta make sure Billy Lowe gets back to like shoot some more stuff. All this other stuff. Like, it's all talking around him. And, like, he's kind of just like this, you know, it's the, speaking of another Simpsons gag, like, when Billy Lowe's not on the screen, everyone should be asking, where's Billy Lowe? It's also that, where it's just like, oh, we gotta talk about this guy who's, like, the least compelling Bruce Lee character by default because he's not played by Bruce Lee that much. And when he does show up, he's obviously, like, in the corner, in shadows, or even head-on, he's still just, like, just very, like, stiff. These guys don't have any of that, like, smooth flexibility that Lee had. And I think also to mention like I was kind of trying to make this point earlier about the Colleen Camp thing. The third element of her that I find kind of almost distasteful is like, it feels like they wanted to cast somebody who looked a lot like his widow, Linda Lee Caldwell, in a way that I find also distasteful, but not the most overtly distasteful thing they do related to Bruce Lee and his family. We'll get to that in, I think, a second. But yeah, it feels also like kind of like that, where like the meta thing is just almost like a laziness of like, oh, she looks kind of like his widow. Remember his widow? The lady who just lost her fucking husband and has to raise the 2 children that they had together by herself? Isn't that like a fun connection? Like, no, man, this just reminded me, this is a bummer. It's a boring bummer every time they have just like her talking about like, oh, I miss, Billy Lowe, I miss my love, and what he meant to like, Hong Kong culture and like martial arts and cinema and all this other stuff. It's like, cool, man, that's, you're not saying anything interesting though with it. It's just like, it's just sad and a bummer, but disguised as like, oh, we gotta catch this guy so we can have more action beats happen. And like, aside from like the motorcycle bit I referenced at the end, I think the one fight that happens like at the bad guy's compound is like the closest we get to a competent Bruce Lee fight in this movie. And I think it's like completely adequate and forgettable. And weirdly, I think the best action sequence of this movie is when they don't even bother having Billy Lowe in it, where it's at that martial arts competition, where it's 2 people who had worked with Bruce Lee, Bob Wall, who was in Enter the Dragon as well, just like the big, tall, white guy with like the big kind of almost afro and like beard. That guy versus Sammo Hung, who at this point was kind of like up and coming, and actually choreographed some of the action sequences in this particular movie, but had worked with Lee. And I think that like one fight sequence is kind of fun because like, oh, it's 2 people fighting who are like kind of, like competent and also have like different fighting styles, and it feels closer to like the Bruce Lee action we get kind of later on because they don't have to work around a dead man's visage.
Yeah, I like that scene, or even like, and this is not even one that has, it still has some of the obvious like cutting back and forth, but like the one where they fight in the locker room, I quite like that one. I like it, again, just the sort of video game connection, just because like Bruce Lee walks into the room, the guy like sees him, and it's like, oh, it's Billy Lowe, and they just start fighting, which feels very like video gamey. They just like that's how they're.
You've entered this room that activated the game mechanics. Now we have to fight each other.
Right, that's the cut scene, and then now like yeah, there's the fight. And I just that sequence is like funnily staged, I think, with like all the people outside the room and they're trying to get in and stuff like that, which is like that scene happens, and then like it's funny in these movies every time the villain is like, why couldn't you take him out? It's just this one. Why? Who is this guy? He's just taking us out. Like, what? You guys are incompetent. And like, that's where I think the movie's like getting a bit closer to the other like Bruce Lee movies in the kind of in that spirit. But like we mentioned, all that stuff with the villains is just like really, really, really bad, I think.
And it's made even worse where like in this world he's basically like a Bruce Lee stand-in, Billy Lowe. So you're like, I don't know, man, if you like that whole excuse of like, how could this guy not defeat? It's like, this guy's like internationally famous for being a martial arts legend in the universe of this movie. Like, I don't get why you're like this befuddled by like, what? You couldn't fight him off? Like, I don't know. If he's like Bruce Lee, this motherfucker has been shown to kick people's asses brutally. Like, when you're calling that much attention to, like, the Bruce Lee connection on, like, that meta level, it also makes those sequences even more annoying where it's like, of course they didn't fucking beat him. He's Billy Lowe, who fucks everybody up on screen in, like, multiple movies.
Yeah, and it's also, like, again, I think this movie is, like, trying to lean more into the goofiness of the other Bruce Lee movies, but it is also really weird when, like, Billy Lowe shows up in like disguise, very obviously like it's not a good disguise, I want to say, like on Billy Lowe's part. It's just a really, really bad like beard.
It's a really bad like on. Spirit gum fucking beard that he has on. Yeah.
Yeah, and the bad guys are like, he looks kind of familiar. I recognized his moves, and I'm just like, come on, guys, like it's so obviously Bruce Lee. Where like, I don't know. It doesn't. It tries to go for that same kind of goofy spirit and over the top kind of like attitude with the villains, but it's not the same at all. It just doesn't get there at all.
Well, a big reason for that is like the really like upsetting 1-2 punch that happens like in the middle of this movie, where the reason he is wearing these disguises is because while he's on set trying to do a stunt, which is, by the way, the straight out of Fist of Fury. That's like literally the ending shot of Fist of Fury when he's like jumping up, and the assistant director's like, hey, everybody, you gangsters, here are these guns with blanks in them. Like, our main assassin guy puts a real bullet inside the gun and then shoots Billy Lowe in the face. Now, this was a while before the Brandon Lee tragedy, but just on like a cosmic level, deeply upsetting that's in here.
It's very bizarre. I know that there is this kind of like, obviously the mythos and the kind of the rumor, and that, you know, it spirals out of control, but that sort of idea of this like curse of like the Lee family or whatever, like, yeah, I don't think that that's like true at all, but it is a very like strange, bizarre, and like really tragic way of like that this all works, especially like watching this today for the first time when I was like, oh, this is like, oh, it's very bizarre. Yeah.
Right, but then that didn't prepare you for, after that, like, Billy Lowe was in the hospital and he's got like all his face bandages on to conveniently hide his face. And the doctor's like, well, I guess I'll break all protocol and legally fake the document so it says you're dead. And then we'll fake the funeral. And they show footage of this faked funeral, which I'm not sure if you're aware, Bryan, is actual footage from Bruce Lee's memorial service.
Yeah.
Down to, there's a shot of, like, the open casket coffin, and you see Bruce Lee in the coffin.
That's what I was wondering if that was his actual...
That's him. Yeah.
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 And again, it's like what I was talking about earlier of like, if you can't do the kind of like initial plot that this movie was going to be, of like just the sort of 5 boss rush that Bruce Lee wanted to do, why would you make it like this? Why would you have it tied this closely to reality? Like it makes it feel more, not just like exploitative, but it makes it feel just sad to watch. Where like watching this, I could, even the good parts I couldn't even like really enjoy because the movie is reminding you of the real life tragedy. Again, I don't mean to just recall like other kind of cases where celebrities have died in movie, but like it's not even like a kind of like Black Panther Wakanda Forever thing. I like the way that movie sort of wrestles with the death of Chadwick Boseman and feels like it's actually a movie about these people going through this pain and this grief like we all are in real life. This is not that.
No.
Like at all. And it feels just really, really disgusting, I think. That scene is like really, really ugh.
Yeah, especially when in the Warrior's Journey documentary they establish, or no, I think it was in the Bruceploitation one, whichever one of those two, they established that like that was all shot as kind of like the initial like sort of like documentary footage of like, oh, here's everybody like coming to Bruce Lee's funeral and all this tragedy. And they also had footage, apparently like that same crew went to Bruce Lee's house and just shot his empty house, like even inside, of like, oh, look, all the greatness that was here is now silenced, shit like that. So it's coming from this like horribly exploitative place of like that footage and its original purpose, and putting it once again into this where it's like, oh, Billy Lowe's faked his death, and look, they've made it seem really, really accurate by having Bruce Lee's actual corpse inside that fucking coffin, that's open casket. And then later on when they're like, oh, let's check the body, and then like the one guy, like, they dig it up and they like poke the head, and it turns out it's like a ceramic fucking like cast, I guess, or whatever, Billy Lowe's old face. That shit is where, once again, this goes beyond like, oh, trying to preserve Bruce Lee's older footage that never got released and putting it out for the public, and becomes just fucking disgusting in a way that like I'm deeply offended by.
Especially, yeah, that scene where they're like, dig him up. I'm like, no, what are you fucking doing, man? Like,
nope.
It's yeah, but like, I can understand, right? Like, you have this footage of Bruce Lee, like, you know, iconic movie star, and especially with the whole yellow jumpsuit becoming so iconic, and like I understand like wanting to like show this like the last footage he shot and the sort of final unfinished film he made, but like doing it like this is not the way to do it. Like there are far more respectful ways to like handle a kind of posthumous thing like this. Like I mean like again, just thinking of other situations like this, like I think a lot of this kind of posthumous people exploiting the death of like artists happens a lot in like music. When Mac Miller died, and what's his name, John Bryan went and finished this album, the album Circles, and it's like incredibly respectful. It sounds incredible. It's someone who was very close with Mac Miller and who like obviously knew him very personally, and it feels so like beautiful, like as a beautiful tribute to him, and that he could finish this. Seeing the footage at the end of like actual Bruce Lee and doing the fight scenes with like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is really great, but what you have to sit through to get to that point is not worth it. I just like wish that it could have been like any other way besides this very weird plot.
It's literally like a solid 85 minutes of like ghastly fucking exploitation of a real man who fucking died, and not like you're mentioning in a way that feels at all respectful, like, and not in a way that also feels like it's competently done because of stuff like you mentioned, like Furious 7, where like that is even a movie that like they were only about like halfway I think through filming when Paul Walker passed away. Like that movie at least has like other interesting characters in that big ensemble cast you can kind of divert attention over to. And admittingly, like, technology had advanced to the point where you could kind of have, like, the face replacement stuff that really worked. But even then, there's also, like, when they do show off Paul Walker in those scenes, like, it's very clear that James Wan knows how to shoot, so, like, we're not immediately focused on him. We are, like, at a distance, potentially. It's at least, like, competently put together to where you're not constantly thinking, like, that guy's not Paul Walker. It's just, like, it's actually, like, really well done filmmaking to work around that while also being respectful. And here it's deeply disrespectful and shitty and awful and just ghastly.
I don't want to like put blame on like anyone in particular. I do think that it's like clearly something with like the studio, but like Robert Klaus, like Enter the Dragon is pretty well directed, like for the most part. Again, it's not as whether it's better or not than like Way of the Dragon. I think that's kind of like up for debate, but like it's not like he's a bad director, it seems, but like I just don't think there's a way to make something out of this situation. And like it is one of these weird situations where like we have to look at this movie, but like should they have just not done this? Probably. Like they probably should have just like, I don't know, left the footage and included in like a documentary, like you said. Like they just like put out
like they did in
footage.
Bruce Lee, A Warrior's Journey. That's literally what it's like. It's
right.
Like an hour of a documentary and then the fucking Game of Death footage. Like, yeah, do that.
Yeah,
way
like
more respectful.
Have it out there for kind of preservation and kind of like, legacy's sake, but don't do this where you are like just being incredibly exploitative and making it really obvious how exploitative you're being, and just doing a really shitty job of doing it, because this movie looks awful. It's not even just like the weird, like, some footage is clearly just inserted from other movies, some footage is just like of lesser quality, like all that stuff, but it's just like just not that interesting to like look at, or to even just like like you mentioned, like some of the action sequences are just like not that great. Like they're just not.
It's very flatly presented.
Yeah,
it's very flat. Not a lot of like even like wide shots. A lot of like the bad kind of cross-cutting stuff that you would get, especially in like 90s forward American action movies. For like a lot of this stuff that feels just like, there's certain points that almost feel like the one infamous thing from, I believe it's Taken 3, where Liam Neeson's climbing the fence and they do it in like 45 cuts. Because they have to work around having a 60-year-old man climb a fence. It feels like almost that kind of like choppily put together. And not helped once again by just like how often these doubles show up and they don't feel like they really embody much about Bruce Lee, to the degree that like I also watched like earlier today Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, which is like a biopic kind of thing starring Jason Scott Lee, no relation, who doesn't look like Bruce Lee, but like from the jump, there's a lot of like bits where he does do kind of like the, big action choreography, like fight sequences, and it feels like he's still embodying the spirit of him. So in a way that like would work, as opposed to it's just a cash grab kind of thing, and these doubles aren't given the time or the investment to like be able to do that kind of like accurate sort of like close depiction, especially when we do get the final footage, which we should just get into. I think the actual final like actual game of death footage, where we should note there are a lot of points, particularly near the very end of the movie, where like you do have the double show up, and it's like fucking turning a light switch on and off for how like fucking it just suddenly changes the quality of the footage, the way that it's shot, because this is all the stuff that Bruce Lee directed mixed with some of the Robert Close stuff just to like get a plot together, quote unquote, this great amazing plot we've been talking about that we are so invested in, and bring it to a close. And it's literally like, it's right after, he like beats up that one motorcycle guy, and then he walks into like that kitchen, and then he goes up the stairs. And you can tell instantly from the moment that guy goes up the fucking stairs, from like the double walk up the stairs, like that's Bruce Lee going up those fucking stairs, finally. That's it.
It's like a fucking bolt of electricity, like going in, because like I was checked out for like an hour before this, like just like complete. I was thinking of other things. I was thinking of replaying Sifu. Like I was just thinking of like anything else. And then like, yeah, as soon as he walks in, you're like, oh, huh, finally it's him. Like I'm awake now. And even like before that, like I think like although the like motorcycle fight has a bit of the kind of cutting as well, it still has a bit of like the set piece is really well done. I especially love like the part where he's like has his helmet on the motorcycle across from another guy, and the guy's like, take your helmet off, and then he just like rams into him. He doesn't do the full like I thought of like from Gemini Man when Will Smith, when he like throws the bike at him. He doesn't do that, but it's kind of similar, and it's a very cool like action sequence, and the movie's just been lacking so much of that. So by this point, you're just like, I'll take anything I can get at this point, But
let's talk more about the actual Bruce Lee footage. So like he goes up those stairs, and this is where he initially fights against Dan Inosato. Right there, like that guy. Also, like immediately, just like he has like the black gi on, he has the two like red nunchucks that he like is doing the shave and a haircut thing. You're instantly just like, oh yeah, this guy, Bruce Lee has to fucking fight against, and it's gonna be like a corker. And the way that Bruce Lee also picks up like that one kind of like the stick thing, and he just like starts moving it around the floor, instantly just like so much more life in the Billy Lowe character immediately. With the way he's just even like presenting himself, the way he's like being so smooth. Even like when he gets up to the top of the stairs and he's looking at Dan, and he's just like kind of slumped over with like the way his shoulders are kind of like leaning down, it feels just like so expressive. Where it's like, this guy's almost like a cartoon character just waiting, like, all right, yeah, we're waiting. He feels like fluid and animated, like in that way. And he's just waiting for like, come on, man, we're gonna get this fight fucking started. And that fight fucking rules. Instantly, just like, oh my god, where was this choreography? Where was the shot composition? Where was this motherfucker just doing his sounds and doing it like in a way more intimidating way, even though he's obviously dubbed. Like, just the way that he even mouths these sounds is so instantly better than all the other bullshit we've seen.
Yeah, and like, again, just the way that it's shot, you get these like really, because like all these movies that I have seen of his like have these really wide shots, like really wide angles where you can see the kind of like I don't know the term, but like on the edges of the frame you can see it kind of distorting a little bit because the angles are so wide, and I love the way that those look because they just capture this entire like room in this one shot, and it looks really, really great, and you get this really clear and clean like action set piece, and it's both like reinvigorating because you're like, finally a real like action scene, the reason I wanted to watch this movie, but it does make you like really upset because one, the rest of the movie wasn't like this, but the way that the set piece is like set up with him going up the stairs and like having to face a new bad guy going up the stairs again, like I just love the way that that's like set up, and I wish that the rest of the movie was just that. Like, I know I said this before, but like I just wish that original plot that this movie was supposed to be was what this movie was. And it like, as good as the set piece is, it does upset me a bit that the rest of the movie is so bad, you know?
Also not helped by admittingly the way that it's edited also feels kind of choppy.
Oh,
because
yeah.
there's just, where they're kind of cutting around stuff. And it's even more upsetting if you ever see that Bruce Lee Warrior's Journey, because it's way more footage. Well, I guess not way more. It's like, I would say about 20 minutes as opposed to like 12, because they include a lot more stuff that admittedly, some of it I'm sure was like some of this footage like hadn't been all discovered yet by this point. Because there's even bits like when he gets up to the top, he has like a back and forth with Dan about just like, oh, hey, do you speak English? Can we speak English here? Hey, look, buddy, I don't know if you really want to fight me. Maybe this isn't like the best option for you. And he's like, nope, I'm going to fucking do it. I'm going to fight you, dude. We're going to do it. All right, man, you want to fucking do this? Let's do it. And then he does the shave and the haircut 2 bits thing as well. And the two of them like fighting each other. The editing is so much more fluid. It's like based on Bruce Lee's like actual notes of how he won and all this other stuff. And it feels so much more like fluid and lively and engaging in like that footage. And there's more stuff like even with like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who by the way also they show that when that fucking dude shows up in the bad new footage, and you can tell instantly like that's not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I know who Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is, and that sir is not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar like at all. It does not look whatsoever like him, that double. But the whole thing, like the reason he's wearing sunglasses is he has a sensitivity to light. So like when Bruce Lee, like there will be points where he like punch out like the windows of the pagoda so more light can come in, and that like hurts, and that's the weakness that he's using against Kareem. And that's so fucking dope, especially when like there's a point in the Warriors Journey footage where like he gets his sunglasses thrown off and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar just has like red glowing eyes. Like that's how sensitive he is. Like why the fuck wasn't that like that was deemed like no, we can't use that. Like why not? That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm getting annoyed again that like this original movie wasn't ever obviously like very tragic because of his death, but like the fact that like it sounds like a really great movie of just like different bad guys who have different gimmicks, you know, and I love that kind of thing. I do love though in this sequence just like their height difference, where it looks like fucking forced perspective, like Lord of the Rings, like forced perspective, because like he's so tall, like he's massive, and he's wearing these shorts, so you can see how fucking long his legs are, and it's a great sequence because of that, because it uses like their height difference to kind of like how the Billy Lowe character has to kind of like has to fight him differently because of that height difference. It's really great, you know, but
and we did skip over the Jihan Jia stuff that happens like in between those two fights, and that's also like a really fun sequence. Even though very weird that like, oh, we can't include some of that Kareem stuff, we can include like the one shot of that guy talking, but there's no audio at all. You didn't even dub anything in.
That's
at
weird.
all.
I was wondering what that was about. Yeah.
What the fuck, dude? Like, why even have that shot of him talking in there at all? You don't need that even if you're gonna do that. But yeah, their fight's also really good, especially with like that one kind of plays on how like that guy versus Lee is so much more like, oh, I'm in control of this environment. I know what I'm doing here. It feels like he's facing off against a more traditional martial artist in that kind of form, and like really playing on like the weaknesses of that rigidity for him as a character, and just like having him like fucking flung around. Like that's another thing with like this footage, you feel so much more of the impact of like any of like the hits, where just like there were so many points during like the most of the movie I'm like, oh, whatever, that stunt guy got thrown off and they probably landed on a fucking crash pad or some bullshit. I don't feel the impact of it, versus these dudes get hit by Bruce Lee and you're like, oh fuck, you ain't coming back from that, man. That's gonna like fuck up your internal organs.
Yeah, I mean, like, and with a lot of these martial arts movies, obviously, like, you can kind of see a lot of the scenes where, like, someone throws a kick and it's, like, there's clearly a gap in between them and who they're hitting. But less so when it's, like, Bruce Lee doing it, because obviously he was so, like, great at kind of the choreography of it all, and was obviously a martial artist master, like, himself. But, like, yeah, you absolutely get that. And you just get more physicality, like, with the exception of like the scene with the motorcycle goons. You just don't get a lot of like that kind of physicality where people are getting like thrown around like a room, and it's like really refreshing to see, and it has like a lot of impact, and it feels very like weighty, which the rest of the movie just like doesn't at all.
No, yeah, and you also feel the exhaustion, because that's another thing that like I really like about Bruce Lee is like whenever you have some of these fight scenes, like even though he's like this badass or whatever, there are a lot of shots of him just being exhausted, just like, God, I just fought a guy, I fought a second guy, and now this giant man. I gotta fight. Jesus Christ, what's going on here? There's a bit of that humanity that's also that makes you more endeared to him, where it's just like you're fighting in a way that like I can conceive of no one I know ever being able to fight, but you still are human, and you have to like catch your breath for a second. Just like it also really works, especially in that Warrior's Journey bit. There's a bit more like after he kills Kareem, where he just like walks down the fucking pagoda stairs and just like I gotta get down, and then like he literally breaks open one of the window things. It's just like, hey, are we done? Can I like come back down? Yeah, you're done. Come on down. Like, thank God. Oh, he like stumbles down the stairs because he's just barely able to move after doing 3 fucking martial arts fights.
Yeah, I mean, like this final sequence here is like, I mean, easily the best part of the movie because it has Bruce Lee in it. But like, it just feels really like satisfying, you know, like separate from the rest of the movie. Like it just feels really satisfying to watch, and how quick it is, right? How you get these kind of 3 successive fight scenes, like really kind of gives the movie an energy that it has not had until this point. Because like there's like an hour like chunk where like I was just checked out completely and like because a lot of it is just the plot and like what the gangsters are up to, them uncovering the grave and stuff like that is just like, what the fuck are we doing here? And then we get to this action scene and it feels really satisfying, like, getting to see actual footage of him in the yellow jumpsuit doing these sequences. You also understand why that jumpsuit just became so iconic, just based off of the sequence alone, and it's a great sequence, I think.
Yeah, particularly one of my favorite bits is the way he takes out the first guy is by like choking him with the nunchucks. Dope. So good. And then even like when he kills Kareem, that's also great. Where just like he's gotta twist his neck, but he's so big, they just like gotta do it. Oh God. Finally, I did it. It feels like he's trying to, like, I don't know, uncork, like, part of a IKEA set that's stuck in. It's like, oh, I put it in wrong, and I gotta, like, really work it to get it out. Ugh, so good. And that makes it all the more upsetting the moment Hugh O'Brien shows up. Like, comes from, like, the attic, basically, and then the double shows up, and then they have a final fight scene there, and then with the older guy who, like, gets thrown down, like, the neon signs or whatever, and then the movie, like, abruptly ends there. It was like a solid, like, 3 minutes of just, like, bullshit. It's like, why do we even bother? Like, he should have, like, fucking just went down the stairs and that's the end of the movie. We don't need to have him fucking fight these other gangsters who we didn't give a shit about. That after this, like, massive high of seeing all this Bruce Lee footage, the movie just has a wet fart and says goodbye. Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I mean, I kind of like the like James Bond kind of like effects of like they're at the end, they're also at the beginning credit sequence, but yeah, I agree. It's just kind of like it's just like, it's over now. Okay, whatever. Like it really just doesn't feel consequential at all.
Honestly, that stuff feels, especially the end credits montage, feels even like just more offensive to me because it's presented as almost like a tribute to Bruce Lee, and has that one shot that's from The Big Boss where like he's looking up contemplatively. And he's just like, oh man, I guess. And that's like your final shot. So it's like, oh, if they had put like a dedicated to Bruce Lee thing down there, I would have like spat at my 4K television. Like, how fucking dare you guys do that? Try and make this like, oh, the man that we loved so much. You showed his corpse like 30 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Fuck off, guys.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, yeah, the movie does present it as like a weird tribute with the footage of him at the end, and like there's the one where he's like moving his arms in like a circular kind of way, and like we get these kind of like I don't know what you would call them. You know what I mean? Like, when you see like the other arms as well.
Right.
And like, again, kind of cool, but at this point, it's like, no, yeah, like I'm just not interested in you trying to give tribute to a person whose memory you've kind of desecrated over the past like 100 minutes, the ending notwithstanding. But yeah.
Yeah. So any other final thoughts about Game of Death, Brian? Or
Well, the only other like another kind of video game thing I kind of liked, kind of connection. I believe it's after that fight in the locker room when he knocks out Carl, I believe his name is. When he says like "you lose, Carl," just very like arcade like fighter, like the way that line is delivered is quite interesting, I think. Also the music in this movie is done by John Barry.
It's a really good score, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very weird that it is John Barry, especially with the kind of the Bond connection and kind of referencing how like these movies are very Bond-esque. But yeah, other than that, I just think like, look, I enjoyed the Bruce Lee movies I watched. I'll talk about one of them in a minute here, but this movie's terrible. It's really bad, and it feels just Frankenstein together. It's incredibly boring, and it feels like it's trying to honor Bruce Lee and trying to be a tribute to him and his memory. It doesn't even get the spirit of what made the Bruce Lee movies, again, the ones that I have seen, like, work, which is these very basic plots, these kind of archetypal characters, these goofy, over-the-top villains. It tries to do that, but it fails completely because it's incredibly boring. We spend so much time with these villains who are just really boring, and when we do get like footage of Bruce Lee, the movie is good, but like, to what end? Like, if you have to get through so much of this slog, just watch like the footage on YouTube. Like, it was almost what I would suggest to someone if you're interested in seeing like where Bruce Lee's like iconic yellow jumpsuit comes from. Like, just watch that kind of like 15-minute chunk on YouTube, and you would get a better experience than we had watching this movie.
Or I would personally recommend watching that Bruce Lee A Warrior's Journey documentary.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because that has, one, more footage, and two, actually gives you context for Bruce Lee prior to it. Here's the footage, what we have together, like whatever has survived, presented all uncut, and it feels like a much more engaging experience than this, yeah. Especially, there's the weird thing too, we've been mentioning kind of like the Tarantino influence. Also notably, while he's in that yellow jumpsuit fighting against Kareem, a lot of shots of Kareem's feet. Did that awaken something else? Maybe for Tarantino?
His awakening was seeing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's feet.
Not bad feet, whatever, fine.
I mean, hey, yeah.
Also, his legs, like you mentioned, his legs are so massive, and you can see his veins. Yeah. Like, the veins that run up his fucking giant-ass tree trunk legs. Insane. Oh, there's also a really funny bit during that where he, like, I think, is it during... No, I think this was in the Warrior's Journey bit, where, like, one of the other guys, which we didn't mention this, but there's a bit of, like, that Bruce Lee footage earlier on when they reference, like, oh, don't forget about, whatever his name's like, I think, like, Wang or something like that. And how he faced off against the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar character, and they cut to, like, footage of Kareem, like, killing that guy, basically, doing, like, a martial arts fight against him. In the other footage, there's a point where, like, that guy's trying to go up the stairs, and Kareem, like, literally uses his, like, dunking skills to, like, throw him off the stairs. Like, he jumps up and on the side of the stairs and, like, fucking throws him off. Why that? Because that's not in the Game of Death footage, right? In, like, the actual movie, I don't think.
I don't think so, no. But
No.
forgive me if I've forgotten, because I just did not have a good time watching this.
No, I don't blame you. Yeah, because I agree with all the stuff you said, and like we mentioned before, this is truly, I think, the worst movie we've covered for the show, because of how, like, ghastly and abominable and offensive it is. It just feels like so much of this, like, boring, cobbled-together bullshit that, like, for that new footage, whenever you do, like, kind of gain any kind of interest. It's in the negative way of, like, you're desecrating a man's literal corpse in this footage. How fucking dare you do that? That's so offensive and ghastly. And then it's other boring shit. And, you know, Colin Camp getting a check and singing a song that's pretty lame. And then the Bruce Lee stuff happens at the end, and it's really fun. That's just the real problem with it. I know this is part of the reason it's like a part of Criterion is that they released the big Bruce Lee box set, which has like the earlier 4 movies, Game of Death, and also apparently Game of Death 2, which was like this movie that it was completely made up of like old Bruce Lee footage and some other, like, you know, like the doubles and all that other shit, which they did just like a couple years later. And I'm like, I get why Criterion would want to put the original Game of Death on there, maybe, because of, like, you know, it was like the last movie that had original footage with Bruce Lee in it. But putting Game of Death 2 on there feels so weird. Like, why? Why would you even fucking bother that? That's not nearly we don't need that kind of comprehensiveness from Criterion to do that necessarily. I would definitely consider picking up, especially having seen all the other Bruce Lee movies. I'd love to pick up that box set, but I don't think I'd really touch the Game of Death disc unless there are like other bonus features. Maybe. I don't know if that Warrior's Journey one is one of the bonus features, but once again, I would recommend to anybody, like, don't watch Game of Death. Watch that documentary. It's on Tubi currently. That's how I watched it. That's like way more of an engaging time that, once again, has respect for Bruce Lee and also has way more of that footage than this fucking, like, abysmal, cobbled together, like, horror show of a fucking exploitation of Bruce Lee's images. So yeah, real terrible. Definitely one of the worst movies also that has like a spine on the Criterion collection.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah, but I mean, again, like you said, like, very cool that they at least put out that box set. You can basically watch his filmography there if you get that box set, which I think is very cool. And I think, like, you know, I would certainly like to get it at some point because, you know, the ones I have seen are good, and so yeah. But Game of Death is not. So,
not one of the good ones, no. But perhaps we'll talk about a good one, as you've been subtly hinting at, Bryan, this whole time, as we get to our usual segment, Between the Lines. So on Between the Lines, every single episode, Bryan and I recommend a movie that, you know, could be a potential alternate choice for the letter that we're talking about today, or maybe an alternate choice, especially for E for Egregious, of like, hey, here's like a good movie you could watch instead of this bullshit. So, Bryan, do you have such a recommendation for Between the Lines this week?
I do. Yeah, I am recommending one of the other Bruce Lee movies I watched. I'm going to recommend The Way of the Dragon from 1972, which also directed by Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee plays Tang Lung, who I believe it is his like master's niece, who he is sent to Rome because she inherited this restaurant, and they are being like extorted by these goons who are just these like archetypal like gangsters who just it's really, really, really great to just see, like, some of them are, like, Italian, some of them are from Hong Kong, but, like, just these fucking goons, man. They're so funny. And this movie is just him protecting the restaurant, and there's the workers there who they're training in martial arts to defend the restaurant before he gets there, and he kind of works with them. He kind of tries to maybe train them a little bit, and again, I said this earlier, but like very much inspired by like a Western. It feels very much like, you know, he's the one, the lone cowboy who comes into town and is protecting the good innocent people from these like awful gangsters who are like so so like exaggerated and big and goofy and ridiculous. And this movie is ridiculous. Like, it has like weird plot twists, like, that are just so bizarre and so weird. And yet it's really entertaining. You get a lot of that great, like, Bruce Lee beating people up. There's a great kind of sequence early on where he like is practicing with all these guys, and then the goons show up, and he like beats all of them, and it's a really, really, really great sequence. And I think like it's shot really well as well. Like I mentioned, the kind of like really wide angles that a lot of these movies are, and it's just the way that he captures like these huge rooms and gives them like a lot of space by like shooting them with these wide angles, that I really, really love. And this is also the one where like basically as the goons just keep getting beat up over and over again as they try to like get money out of this restaurant, they basically hire like 3 of the best martial artists in the world, one from Europe, one from Japan, and one from America, the last one of which is Chuck Norris. Again, yeah, it builds to this kind of like great final battle with like these bosses basically at the Coliseum, of course, which is the footage that you see at the beginning of Game of Death. And this is the battle that I think just like is straight up just a Street Fighter fight. Like it's shot like a Street Fighter like video game fight. It has just like so many of those like moves and just everything about it. It also has just a great little bit where they're fighting and Bruce Lee like rips a bunch of hair off of Chuck Norris's chest, which I thought was just the funniest thing. Yeah,
also, a lot of cats at the Coliseum in that final sequence.
Yes, it's really funny.
His audience is literally just like a bunch of stray kittens, just like meow, meow, meow. They wanted to like nuzzle up to Chuck Norris because it reminded them of their mother.
Yeah, but also just like great like zooms, like in terms of the filmmaking of it all, like just great like long zooms throughout this entire movie. It's just a ball. Like it's a really fun movie. It does like everything that Game of Death doesn't do, in that it has like great action sequences. The story is like it's bare bones, but like it's also just very simple in terms of like, these are some gangsters. They're bad. Bruce Lee's gonna kick their ass. And there's some, like I said, there's some twists. There's some, some revelations are revealed and some stuff happens. But like, it has a real momentum to it. It's got real like energy. Bruce Lee is great in this movie. I really like just how he carries himself around like these gangsters, where he is like so casual and just kind of beats them up really easily. Yeah, it's just a really, really, really good movie. Yeah, you've seen this movie. What do you think of Way of the Dragon?
Yeah, this was one of the ones I hadn't seen until kind of prep for this episode, and I love this one. I think this is my favorite of the Bruce Lee movies. If nothing else, because like this is the one that he fully directed, and it feels so much more accomplished in the way of like he knows how to shoot not just himself but the other fighters. Like Bob Wall also shows up in this as like one of like the American guys who he faces off against at a certain point. And it also has like so much great humor. Like even before he fights anybody, the opening bits of this are him at the airport, and he's like bumbling around, like he goes over to the one restaurant, and it's just like he can't read the menu, and he's trying to like point out like this, and the waitress is like, what are you talking about? Like that kind of like high society bullshit.
Yeah, it's a very just, exaggerated physical comedy, which is
right, really fun like physical comedy stuff there. Or even one of my favorite things, especially as like a guy who is Italian who loves Italian bullshit stereotypes. The one goon who literally like faces off against Bruce Lee, like after he just fought some guys, responds with "Mamma Mia" and then hits himself with his own nunchuck.
he looks up like to the sky, like he stops what he's doing. He looks up, he goes, "Mamma Mia."
Finally, representation of me. In martial arts cinema, 100% what I would do if I had to fight Bruce Lee and I had a nunchuck. I'd fuck up and like hit my own head. Exactly what I would do. But no, that all that stuff's great. And even the way that he shoots Italy, such a weird choice for a location, but he does a great job of like really like showcasing even like the stuff at the Coliseum. Like there's some points when like the actual fight happens, it's very clearly like a set. with like the kind of backdrop of the Coliseum behind him. But the actual Coliseum footage looks amazing, and it feels just like a true gladiator has entered the ring. Sorry, Gladiator 2, but we have a real contender here in Bruce Lee. But yeah, it's just like stuff like that, or even another weird physical comedy bit. The bit where just like he gets picked up by like an Italian lady and brought up to like her bedroom, and she starts like undressing, and he's like, "Oh no!" and then he like walks out the fucking door. Yeah. Just like so funny. It feels once again just like it's like you mentioned. It's very bare bones plot, but it has enough like showcase for like little martial arts beats like that, or the bit where like they both come back home to like the niece's apartment, and there's a guy in there who's like trying to shoot Bruce Lee, and they like have a little fight there. It allows for just like very simple like, okay, let's have this set piece here, this bit, and also some physical comedy bits. Like even there's a whole thing where like in the restaurant they have a massive fight. And I love that the uncle's like, no, don't damage the restaurant. Don't hurt our restaurant. While they're like trying to fight. And then he gets rid of those guys. And then he goes up to the door because he hears some people. It's just like, oh, is that somebody? And Bruce Lee's about to like fucking use his karate chops. And then all of a sudden, like he's about to like hit whoever's like about to enter the door. And it's just like a bunch of tourists. And I'm like, oh yeah, come in. No, come in. They're like, oh, yes, please. Come in. Great stuff. Yeah, this is definitely, I would say, my favorite. I like the other 3 Bruce Lee movies, but I think this one is just like head and shoulders above because it feels like it's him actually getting to do his own specific sort of form of martial arts and really like express it beautifully. And it once again really underlines all the bullshit in Game of Death that sucks so hard.
It's got a real personality to it, which I really like love and is really lacking from Game of Death, like you said.
Well, my recommendation is for a different movie, though also kind of martial arts adjacent, and involves somebody who did work briefly with Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, because he has very small kind of like blink and you'll miss it sort of fight bits in Fists of Fury and Enter the Dragon. Young Jackie Chan is in both of those. But I am recommending his movie, which also got Criterion released recently, along with its first sequel, Police Story from 1985, which basically follows Jackie Chan as Kevin Chan, who is the super cop who is trying to basically stop like a drug lord from, you know, going all about trying to like send drugs into Hong Kong. And it also is like, it's a very bare bones plot. Because and he gets accused of murder and all this other stuff, trying to clear his name. It's a very basic kind of plot, but it's just a showcase for Jackie Chan, one of the great martial arts actors, also doing his thing. And it's so interesting because you can tell, like, sort of the influence we were talking about Bruce Lee, you can tell Jackie Chan was clearly inspired by Bruce Lee. And, like, you know, he's said many times that, like, the work he did on Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon helped him kind of propel forward in the Hong Kong action scene. But with this movie, Jackie Chan shows off that like he's much more sort of like clownish in a way that I'm saying as a compliment, because there's so many bits of like him interacting with Maggie Chung, his love interest, where like he'll be like, you know, trying to have a conversation with her, but he's got like his car that he's trying to like, he has faulty brakes. So he's like trying to basically like propel the car uphill while it's rolling down as he's having a conversation with her and shit like that. It's just like great physical comedy. Or a whole bit where like he's trying to answer the phone and he's not sure which, there's like 3 different phones. So he's like at his chair and he's like moving around trying to like capture one with like his hand, one with his foot, shit like that. Amazing. Yeah, there's just like so many great physical comedy bits. And then the actual action is insane. Like this movie opens, I believe, with the whole like thing at the one village, where basically Jackie Chan destroys like a village.
The hill.
Of this movie.
Yeah.
Yes. It's crazy.
The bus? It's also the bus, right?
Right. The bus thing also happens here. Yes. And it's just like these set pieces are spellbinding. And Jackie Chan also directed and co-wrote this movie. And it feels once again kind of in a similar way to Way of the Dragon, like a martial artist who had worked previously on like other smaller things, getting his chance to be like, hey, I'm going to put it all out here. And he does it by just, quite frankly, in this movie in particular, destroying so much glass. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Hong Kong had a glass shortage in 1984 or whenever they shot this. Because there is so much, like, fucking glass-breaking bits, including the big finale set piece at that mall, when, like, he fucking glides down that fucking, like weird glass centerpiece or whatever. Amazing. Just, like, so many times where you're just like, I would hate to be the medic on this set. Because you'd be constantly in a state of, like, pure terror. Just like, oh, God. I have to save Jackie from this stunt.
Well, and like you're watching it and you're like, how did no one get hurt? And then it cuts to like the credits and it does the whole like B-roll and you're like, oh no, people got hurt like
People
bad
got horribly
during
hurt,
this. Yeah,
Jackie
but
Chan's very famous for like the kind of outtake blooper reel of just like people getting their asses handed to them by gravity and nature, in a really funny way. And I've seen the there's Police Story 2, which is also very fun. It has a lot of the similar like glass breaking bits, which those two were released as part of like a Criterion set. But I will say I did watch on the Criterion channel Police Story 3, which is the one with Michelle Yeoh in it. And that movie also fucking rocks. I would say I prefer, like, Police Story is my favorite, but then 3 is really great. And then 2 is also very good. They're all, like, really fun. But I do kind of wish just, like, I don't know, Criterion. Come on, put out that third one, too. I'd love, like, a 3. Like, that trilogy box set, perfect. No, I know there's other Police Stories after that. But yeah, I just think, like, Police Story is a phenomenal showcase, especially of, like, this early Jackie Chan. And as someone who, admittingly, doesn't have as much familiarity with, like, classic Jackie Chan as much as some of his American productions. Like, I saw The Tuxedo in the theater, as everyone did. But yeah, that was, like, the first one I really saw, like, the classic Jackie Chan kind of antics. I'm like, this is a masterpiece. This is just, like, insane shit. And based on your, interruptions here, Brian, I assume you've seen this movie?
yeah, I mean, this is one of the best action movies ever made, I think. I mean, like, the opening set piece is so insane and so crazy, and you think to yourself, like, well, that's the best bit of the movie, surely. And no, the movie has, like, so much stuff. Like, I love that phone scene that you mentioned earlier, like, just so funny, so much physical comedy. What I love about the final set piece, which is, like, it's just so great because of, again, like we mentioned with Bruce Lee, like, Jackie Chan's, like, physicality is so important to who he is and his screen persona. And when he, like, slides down that, like, giant thing at the end, the movie shows it, like, 4 times from, like, 4 different angles. And it's riveting every time. Like, you're like, yes, another angle, come on, one more, and it's absolutely incredible. I love Police Story. I think it's so good. Maggie Chung is also really good. She's really funny as, like, his girlfriend who gets kind of, like, jealous at a certain point. There's, like, if I remember correctly, there's a scene with a cake, which I remember being quite funny. Yeah, I also love Police Story 2. I think it's maybe almost as good as Police Story 1. And then Police Story 3, I think, he did not direct Police Story 3, right? I think that's probably why it's not in the Criterion
well, that, and I'm sure it's also like a rights thing. I wouldn't be surprised about as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but Police Story 3, I think,
3,
like...
Super Cop, by the way.
Super Cop, yeah. And I think, like, around the time Michelle Yeoh won her Oscar, that the clip of her with the bike on the train was going viral, but, like, it's such an incredible sequence. And, like, she fucking rules. And yeah, I mean, if you want to have a really good, like, weekend, you could watch just the first 3 Police Story movies, and that would just be, like, the most perfect time, you know. Apart from all of this, like, Jackie Chan as a director, I mean, the way he directs these action sequences in this entire movie is, like, really impressive. And as someone like you said, like, I mainly know him from his, like, his Hollywood movies. Like, I just didn't know he had that kind of, like, dimensionality to him, that he could, like, also direct these incredible sequences. It's like, yeah, it's really incredible.
Right, especially when any reasonable person is like, oh, I'm about to do this horrible stunt, and you should be just focused on that, but you're also like, well, make sure that we have this angle here and this one over here, and make sure you get me falling down this massive stunt. Like, I'd be just, like, pissing my pants over doing the stunt. And he's got, like, all these other things to consider. It's insane. So
yeah, and, like, watching the bloopers where he's, like, bleeding, you know, and imagining that he still has to, like, direct stuff. It's like, it's so impressive. And I think, like, the, like, not just the physicality, but, like, the physical, like, toll that it takes on him, clearly, like, as you see by those bloopers, is, like, and like, the, you know, the B-roll is, like, is so impressive. And it, like, really kind of made me kind of get this newfound respect for, like, Jackie Chan, because, again, like, I only knew him from, like, Rush Hour and shit, so, like, yeah.
And from, of course, the Kung Fu Panda films where he voiced
Of course.
By the way, a bit of like tying it back into Game of Death. One of the things Bruce Lee wanted to have in his original movie that sadly could never be shot was Jackie Chan would show up as like a crazed fan of his trying to get an autograph. And they would have apparently a bit of like a back and forth, maybe even a bit of a fight scene. I don't know how elaborate that would have been, but Jackie Chan's like a crazed Bruce Lee fan. Can't believe we missed out on that too.
Yeah.
But on that note, let's restate our recommendations for people out there in case they want to add these to their watch list, Brian.
Yeah, I had the 1972 film The Way of the Dragon, which is also directed and stars Bruce Lee.
And I had the 1985 Jackie Chan directorial starring co-writing vehicle, The Original Police Story. But on that note, we're going to start wrapping up here. But we got to thank some people, Brian. We got to thank Burial Grid for our music. Purchases music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for the artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 over on Twitter. And thanks to our Patreon supporters, patreon.com/cinema2letter. For just $1 a month, you all get bonus content that we put out there on the feed. I'm sure it's January right now, so soon we'll be having our some kind of like audio review, kind of maybe review roundup, talking about some of like the other sort of Oscar releases that had been delayed a bit into January. And also at least one big bonus podcast. We haven't talked yet about that, right? Because we're recording this in like early December. So we haven't quite chosen what our January bonus podcast is going to be. But I'm sure we'll have something for you all out there. Though stay tuned for, in the coming months, some big things are going to be happening, Brian. Because we've got the Los Awards coming back. Talking about like our sort of Oscar awards show. Where we award all these different things for different actors and directors and stuff. And then in March Madness, Brian. We haven't picked a topic yet for it, but we're going to be doing something elaborate. Once again, I think maybe a bit of a tease. We've kind of been talking about maybe something action-oriented, tie into Game of Death.
Sure.
Maybe.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, we're still in the planning stages on that, but that'll be coming over on Patreon. Once again, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where you can get stuff either for $1 a month to just join up as a cineast, or you can buy individual audio for $3, the lowest price possible on Patreon. So you can just sample and then from there become a cineast if you want. Really helps out the show, gives us more, opportunity to have the main feed go and allow for like silly stuff that we put over there on the Patreon feed that hopefully entertains all of you out there. Really appreciate it. But if you want more of us somehow, you can find us on whatever hell site. Most likely we're over there at cinema2letter. And you can find me usually on Blue Sky. I've been posting a lot more on Blue Sky recently. Or on Letterboxd at Not the Who's Tommy, and occasionally I'll do some writing at film-cred.com. And real quick, I just wanted to shout out that while we were gone on our little break, our little hiatus mid-season, I did a guest appearance over on the podcast Earth Station Boo, which is a horror movie podcast where I talked with the hosts over there about the New Year's-themed horror film Bloody New Year. It was a lot of fun doing that particular episode. They're a fun group of people, so I'll probably have a link in the description as well for that particular recording. So, go listen to that.
You can also find me on Blue Sky or Twitter still if you really want to, at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can just follow me on Letterboxd, where I'm much more active. So, yeah.
And for more of us in audio form, please subscribe to us over on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on the network? And you can dig into the archives on our Podbean main feed for, the past several seasons of this show and also the old Double-Edged Double Bill stuff. All there for you to peruse. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, that's cool, money can be tight. But the free way to help us out is just to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. Especially, as we want to make sure it's us being visible and not any weird doctored versions of us that we would not want out there. We don't want like a weird... like a double to replace Bryan, and we have like a cardboard cutout in front of him. Of his face.
No, please.
No. Yeah, make sure this is on wax. Like none of that. No AI recreations either. None of that bullshit. Don't do that to us. We don't want that shit. Just like Bruce Lee probably wouldn't have wanted it. As I'm sure he, if he ever found out about Game of Death in that form, his grave would have like propelled up like a fucking cyclone, basically, I think, with his strength. That probably would have happened. But on that note, Brian, it's time that we tease our next episode. Our next episode, our M for Masterpiece pick for the Criterion Collection. A lot of potential ones we could have gone with, but we're going with The Thin Red Line from Terrence Malick, the 1998 film, which I know you're a huge fan of.
Yeah, Malick he's one of my guys, one of my all-time favorites. I love everything he does. There was a very, well, I say brief, but there was a time when I was quite obsessed with his films, and I think almost all his movies are absolute masterpieces. But specifically, The Thin Red Line is a fascinating movie for a lot of reasons. You know, the 20-year gap he took, the massive cast, the fact that a lot of people were cut out of it. A lot of weird stuff going on with that movie, and I think it's still quite impressive. So, yeah, I'm super excited to just be talking about one of my favorite filmmakers of all time.
And I'm curious because I've seen a few Malicks, and I remember, you know, we'll get into this when we're actually in the episode, but I remember having an aversion to Malick. I think that might just be due to, you know, some kind of like weird like snobbery or anti-snobbery kind of thing that I was going through at the time in college, and I was like, I don't know, this isn't so great kind of deal. I'm not that impressed. But, you know, I've matured. I'm older. I'm wiser. I'm curious to, you know, maybe revisit a couple of those and also catch a few other ones off my list, you know, given they're incredibly short movies I can fit into a very small package. I'm sure I'll be able to just watch all of them in a quick succession. But, you know, we'll have some interesting Malick back and forth to go through next time. But until then, everybody, another declaration. I think I'm going to speak for Bryan here. I'm sure he'll agree with me. Another declaration: don't podcast at our funerals. Just don't do that. Don't put a mic up to our open caskets. Don't do that shit. Insanely disrespectful. And don't make, I don't know, Cinema of Death or Game of Leather or whatever.